Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me.
Yeah, good thumbs.
All right, so we can go ahead and get started then. So thank you everyone for being here today. My name is Elisa. I'm with the St. Andrew and St. Joseph Bay's Estuary Program here at Tides and Talks, or Tides and Torts. Today we have guest speakers Billy Moore and Danielle Gadzala. Is that how you say it? Okay. Here to talk about Gopher Tortoises today. These community meetings we invite guest speakers that specialize in different topics related to the watershed. If you have anything you're interested in learning about, please let us know. We can try to add that into our rotation. So I'm going to go ahead and hand this off to Billy. I believe you're starting us. Awesome. Here you go.
Thank you for having me. My name is Billy. I am the area biologist for Pine Log, Point Washington, and Econfina Creek Wildlife Management Areas with FWC. This is Danielle, I guess if you want to introduce yourself. She is the species biologist, conservation biologist from Northwest region. All right, we'll go ahead and introduce the star of the show. The Gopher Tortoise is the only tortoise native to east of the Mississippi River. It's one of 4 species found in North America. The rest are found from Texas, west of California, into Mexico. So the Gopher Tortoise specifically is native to the southeastern coastal plain, Atlantic and Gulf coasts, from very southern South Carolina, the coastal plain to Georgia, throughout Florida, southern Alabama, Mississippi, and then they just get into eastern Louisiana. We'll get more into habitat later, but they occur in a wide variety of habitats. They generally share a few characteristics, and that's well-drained, typically sandy soils that are conducive to burrowing, open canopy, significant herbaceous ground cover, and typically these habitats are fire maintained. So most turtles tend to be semi-aquatic. They have webbed feet, streamlined bodies. Some exceptions are the box turtle, which spend a lot of time on land. Whereas most tortoises spend pretty much all their time on land. And it's a classic example of all tortoises are turtles. They are a specialized group of turtles, but not all turtles are tortoises. So gopher tortoises and other tortoises, they belong to a single family, which is the Testudinidae. And unlike the rest of the turtles, they tend to spend almost all their time on land, so they are terrestrial. You can kind of see some similarities between the box turtle and the gopher tortoise all the way on the right. But tortoises kind of take some of those adaptations to life on land to the extreme. They inhabit some really arid, dry, hot habitats that just don't find other turtles in. So how do you identify a gopher tortoise? Like all tortoises, they are terrestrial. They have some physical traits that kind of help them adapt to life on land instead of aquatic environments. Those include these broad shovel-like front limbs with large kind of spade-shaped claws. Then you can see these stumpy, almost elephant-like back legs. And they have these broad heads with kind of a blunt snout. And these are adaptations for burrowing. The limb shape and size, basically they have these broad shovel-like front limbs. The claws are really efficient at just moving large amounts of soil. And they're also really good when they're facing into the burrow and anchoring into the sides of the burrow wall. So they're really hard to pull back out. And their rear legs, they're stumpy, but they're really strong. They're good at kind of anchoring themselves against the burrow wall as well. So when they're facing forward, other tortoises or any animal they don't want to come into the burrow is going to have a real hard time moving them. So whichever way they're facing, if they don't want to move, they're difficult to move. And they also, you can kind of see the shape of the shell is sort of compressed when you're looking at it head on. And if you've ever seen one of these guys dive into a burrow, they're really good at sliding down into the burrow. Adults tend to be gray, brown, black, or tan. We have two examples of it. Typically, they weigh between 8 and 15 pounds, but the record is over 30, so they can get pretty big. They average about 10 inches long. Some grow, they can grow up to 15 inches or more. We kind of have a range of sizes here. That one being on the high end of the. And gopher tortoises are sexually dimorphic, which means you can tell males and females apart usually. If you want to flip them over, but this is a male that you have on the plastron, that concavity in the back, whereas the female is generally going to just be flat.
Don't look this.
Yeah,
It's one of the plastron. Oh, the whole, oh, no.
And sometimes it's more pronounced than others, but typically the females are just going to be flat. The males have longer gular projection, which is that thing up at the front of the plastron. And interestingly enough, there's pretty big overlap in sizes, but the females on average do tend to be a little larger. My experience, whenever you get the ones that are kind of approaching that maximum size limit, they usually tend to be female.
But this one is the male?
That's a female.
That is the, okay. So she's nice and flat. Those skills.
Yeah, it's an old shell. So gopher tortoises typically breed in the spring, but they can occur throughout the year, generally March through October. Females nest in May and June. They, on average, lay about 6 eggs. Clutch sizes can range from 1 to up to 25 eggs, but generally 4 to 8 is going to be pretty standard size. So not huge clutch sizes. And they're about the size of a ping pong ball, and about the same shape as well. So they're very round. Kind of seeing that picture there. The nests are typically deposited in the sand mound in front of the burrow, which is called the burrow apron. Sometimes the females will just lay in any sunny, open, sandy spot as well, though. Females produce 1 clutch of eggs per year, and they don't always reproduce every year. Incubation time varies depending on latitude, but typically ranges anywhere from 80 to 100 days. So the more temperate climates, it may take a little longer, and in southern Florida, they probably hatch a little faster. And nest predation tends to be really high with gopher tortoises. Females may only produce 1 successful nest every 10 years. They have a lot of nest predators, and primarily those are going to be small or medium-sized mammalian carnivores. So raccoons, possums, coyotes, foxes, skunks, armadillos, and even fire ants are generally problems for the eggs. If they do make it to hatching, that usually occurs in the fall. So early on the early end, late August into October. And once the eggs are ready to hatch, they have, it's called an egg tooth, which lets them break through the shell. And the hatchlings are usually pretty tired once they're out of the eggs, so they take refuge in the burrow typically shortly after hatching. They can also hide in leaf litter. They'll dig little pallets. They are fully capable of digging their own burrows from the start, and they're basically the same shape as the adult burrows, just on a much smaller scale. They are on their own from the day that they hatch, and they are very vulnerable to predators. The juveniles are typically that orange or yellowish color in the middle of the scutes. That's where the scutes are still growing and they're still very soft. It can take up to 7 years or more before the shell really fully hardens. If you ever held one, they actually do feel soft to the touch. So, and again, they have a ton of predators, so burrowing offers the greatest protection from predators as well as from desiccation and just overheating. And much like the nests, mortality is really high in juveniles. So pretty much everything that eats the eggs also eats the babies, along with snakes, birds of prey, crows, even domestic cats and dogs are an issue. However, if they make it through those vulnerable stages, their scutes begin to harden. They get to a size where there's fewer things that can eat them. Adult survivorship is really high. So once they reach that size, the adults can live over 60 years in the wild. And it's not unheard of for them to get into the 90s in captivity. So even so, it does take females 10 to 20 years to reach sexual maturity. So they grow really, really slowly. And for that reason, population monitoring is usually a long-term effort. There's typically a lag in trend one way or the other. So oftentimes we don't notice those declines because it takes decades to really before they become apparent. That's because the adults are so long-lived. Nests generally aren't very successful, and it just takes them a long time to reach maturity.
What is their mortality rate?
It varies from site to site, basically, but usually the majority just do not make it to. It seems like you have different predators and just different things eat them depending on where they are. So it's not high. Just an interesting tidbit, you can estimate the age similar to counting tree rings. You can count the growth rings on the shell. These are called annuli. So if you flip the plastron over, basically represents the growth cycle. It's not the most accurate as the animal gets older and the more they move around, the shell gets worn down. It's harder to see. And it also kind of varies based on latitude. So those growth rings don't necessarily coincide with a year. So it's a ballpark estimate more than anything. Where do they live? In Florida, Gopher tortoises occur throughout the state, so you can find them in all 67 counties. They prefer high, dry, sandy habitats, primarily longleaf pine and oak sandhills, as well as scrub, dry hammocks, scrubby pine flatwoods, dry prairie, coastal grasslands, coastal dunes, and a number of disturbed human-altered habitats as well, such as pastureland, old fields, power line right-of-ways, even like shoulders of roadsides. Typically, these all share some similar characteristics. They tend to be high, dry, and sandy. They all are going to have open canopies, and generally they're going to have significant herbaceous ground covers. That's what the tortoises eat. The biggest threat by far they face is loss of habitat. As it turns out, the habitats that they prefer, things that, stuff that's far from the water table, dry and sandy, is also really coveted by developers. So they tend to get built on pretty regularly. Here's a few examples of some natural communities that you find gopher tortoises in. Mainly upland pine and sandhill longleaf pine forests, as well as scrubbier pine flatwoods. Scrub as well, which true scrub is, you find it on the coast, and generally it's more common in central Florida. And coastal dunes, they will make use of undeveloped coastline. But one thing that most of these natural communities do have in common is historically the structure would be maintained by fire. So these would be reliant on, historically, would be lightning ignited fires. In some of those man-made habitats, mowing or grazing from cattle can kind of replicate what fire would naturally do. But for the most part, these habitats would burn at varying intervals. So currently, prescribed fire is our most important tool for the maintenance and restoration of gopher tortoise habitat. Plants and animals are adapted to it. A lot of them need it, and a significant number of these plants and animals that are adapted to these habitats disappear when fire is lost. So when you remove fire, shrubs start to encroach, the canopy begins to close in, and then you lose all that ground cover that the tortoises would eat. So prescribed fire basically mimics what historically would have been caused by those lightning ignitions. The Native Americans and early settlers also kind of recognized the benefits of it. So prescribed fire as a concept is something that's been around for thousands of years. So what do they eat? Right, so gopher tortoises are herbivores. You're primarily going to eat herbaceous plant materials, so low-lying broadleaf grasses, legumes and other forbs, cactuses, fruits. They'll also occasionally eat insects and invertebrates and something generally just these are for just extra nutrients. So they really benefit from a diverse and abundant ground cover. It's associated again with that open canopy, light penetration, and it's going to be promoted by fire generally. So we can't really talk about the gopher tortoise without talking about the burrow. The burrow is a large reason why they're such a focal point from a conservation standpoint. Structurally, the burrow is about 15 feet in length on average, but it can be much longer. At its deepest point, it's usually about 7 to 10 feet underground. The width of the burrow is generally going to be about the length of the tortoise that dug it. So it's just wide enough for the animal to spin around inside. And more than 350 species use the gopher tortoise's burrow in some capacity. So as I mentioned, fire is a frequent occurrence in these habitats. So the burrow serves as refuge for not only for the tortoise, but for a lot of other animals that either can't fly away or easily run away from approaching fire. And this term ecosystem engineers, it's one that's often associated with gopher tortoises. And that's because gopher tortoises create these burrows that basically form microhabitat, which is a small habitat within a habitat that has a near constant temperature and humidity. So the burrow temperature is regulated naturally from a long wave radiation, and the soil surrounding the burrow insulates it. So basically what you have is this underground tunnel that is going to maintain its temperature and humidity. So it's going to be significantly cooler than ambient temperatures during the hottest parts of the year, and significantly warmer than the air temperature during the coldest parts of the year. And it also provides some protection for the inhabitants from other predators as well as fire. And a lot of species will use the gopher tortoise burrow for foraging and for breeding as well. And another term that is commonly associated with the tortoise is this concept of a keystone species. That's because they have an outsized impact on the communities they inhabit. So we often call this other animals that use these burrows commensal species. That's pretty much a collective term, but what that means is essentially there's a relationship where the commensal species benefits and the tortoise doesn't. So the tortoise creates the habitat. It doesn't really hurt the tortoise, but lots of other species will use the burrow. So in the case of the gopher tortoise, ecosystem engineer and keystone species are kind of terms that go hand in hand. So they create this microhabitat, benefits a whole host of other species. So much so that a decrease in gopher tortoise populations generally coincides with a decrease in the populations of potentially a bunch of other species. And in some cases, lowers species diversity overall. And in addition, not the most glamorous commensals, but there are a couple species that are basically completely dependent on the presence of gopher tortoises. That is a shell moth, which see in that bottom picture, basically feeds on the carapace of dead tortoises, and a species of tick that is specific to the gopher tortoise and only found in burrows. There are also some mutual species that do pull their own weight. Those tend to be insects, specifically dung beetles, which in exchange for food and shelter, they do house cleaning and clean up the poop in the bottom of the burrow. So here are some examples of some animals that you can find in gopher tortoise burrows. Many of these species are state listed for some conservation concerns. So that includes the gopher frog, eastern diamondback rattlesnake, Florida mouse, Florida pine snake, as well as the eastern indigo snake, which in the northern part of the range, they are pretty much dependent on gopher tortoise burrows for overwintering habitat. So unfortunately, in the panhandle where we've lost most of our tortoises, we've also generally had indigo snakes extirpated as well. Here are just some recent examples from some field surveys of different critters using tortoise burrows. On the left is a pine snake that took shelter during a prescribed fire, and we just noticed him hanging out in the entrance. Diamondback rattlesnakes regularly overwinter in gopher tortoise burrows, and gopher frogs will not completely reliant on the burrows. They will use other natural forms of shelter, primarily like stump holes. They really benefit from the presence of gopher tortoises on the landscape. And gopher tortoises are ecosystem engineers in more ways than one. So it's not just the animal communities that they influence, but the plant communities as well. The burrowing activity brings nutrients deep in the soils to the surface level where plants have access to them more easily. So they aerate the soil, they bring up nutrients, and they also help increase plant biodiversity by dispersing and germinating different seeds. So there's a lot of research that shows that the areas immediately around the burrow and the apron have significantly higher biodiversity of plant species than elsewhere. So it's really interesting in longleaf pine communities because they have some of the most diverse ground cover of any ecosystem on Earth. So the tortoise has a small part to play in that as well. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Danielle to talk a little bit about the management plan and some of the policy stuff.
Thank you, Cody.
Fantastic. Well, hello everyone. My name is Danielle Gadzala. I'm the Northwest Regional Species Conservation Biologist. Most of my areas of expertise include non-game species, so it's more of a region-wide view on how habitat conservation and wildlife conservation are intermixing. This is a Gopher Tortoise management plan. Our goal was to restore and maintain secure, viable populations throughout Florida, so the species no longer warrants listing. The species is still listed and it still does maintain its protections. It was created in 2007. It was last revised in 2012 and will be revised again by 2022. And there's another revision upcoming here. The objectives for the Gopher Tortoise management plan are to minimize loss of tortoises, increase and improve habitat, restore populations where they're depleted, and maintain the tortoise as a keystone species. Some conservation actions include research, regulation, permitting, local government coordination, law enforcement, habitat protection, habitat management, incentives, population management, disease management, monitoring, and then outreach and education. All those conservation actions work together to help us achieve our goals as part of the Gopher Tortoise Conservation Plan. The listing status across its range indicates how likely the Gopher tortoise is to become extinct in the near future. As Billy was mentioning, the range extends from South Carolina westward to the extreme eastern Louisiana and south through Florida. It's federally listed as threatened west of Mobile and Tomahawk rivers in Alabama, is a candidate for federal listing in the remainder of the range. Florida is only a portion of its range where the Gopher tortoises are found throughout the states in all 67 counties. The Gopher tortoise is protected in Florida as a threatened species. It is important to conserve gopher tortoises as their populations are in decline. The number one cause for decline is habitat loss, and that's compounded by habitat fragmentation and degradation of habitat, including fire suppression. Billy mentioned how important that prescribed fire is for the ecosystem. In 2008, land use, you can see some of the threats. So we talked a little bit about some of the threats: habitat loss, the fragmentation of habitat where these populations can't move, habitat degradation, suppression of fire, as well as disease. Illegal harvest, also here in the Panhandle, is a threat for the species. Not as much here in this day and age, but in the past they were considered a food source. Road mortality is also considered a threat for the species, as well as domestic dogs. This is projected land use for 2070 if human population doubles here in our state of Florida. This is an image of a permitted relocation for the species. They are pretty significant diggers. They will dig deep down in the burrow. We have to use the backhoe to remove them. This is one of the conservation actions is through permitting. So permitting for relocation of those species when there is going to be impact. The FWC requires and permits the relocation of any gopher tortoise, as well as their burrow, within 25 feet of development activities. In these photos, you can see the process of removing that tortoise from its burrow prior to site development. All tortoises are translocated to a permitted gopher tortoise recipient site and released on site if the habitat is suitable. And that's determined by a gopher tortoise biologist.
I thought this was
This one is Billy's area of expertise, so I'll let him take this one over. This one's
Yeah.
the Eglin Air Force Base translocation.
This was a segue from the previous slide about translocations. Before I was with FWC, I was a biologist at Eglin, and primarily I was involved with the translocation project there, the Gopher Tortoises. It was just a unique situation here. Eglin's a huge area, and prior to probably the 1970s and 80s, it was a combination probably of harvest, like Danielle mentioned, which was in the Panhandle more of an issue in the past and still probably occurs today, but also from habitat degradation through fire suppression on Eglin. Basically, most of the population was in severe decline, and what was left was kind of relegated to what you can see in the pictures, which is a test range. So these are airfields, the periphery of bombing ranges. Basically, they just provided the tortoises like some protection along with that kind of open canopy and plenty to eat. So in the past 40, 50 years, prescribed fire was reintroduced along with other management practices. So there's mechanical clearing and herbicide to really open that canopy back up and get the habitat back to where it needed to be. Despite that, I mean, tens and thousands of acres of now potentially suitable sandhill, we still had very few tortoises on the landscape, and they tended to be kind of in isolated little clusters of subpopulations that they couldn't find one another. And at that point, they may have just been so depleted that they weren't going to recover naturally. So we had all this habitat, no tortoises. So translocation kind of uses a way to bolster tortoise population that may not have been able to recover naturally, just given how few animals there were left and how isolated they were. And right before I left, we actually met a recovery goal. The monitoring efforts suggested that things were going pretty well. There was low mortality with adults. Our translocated populations were reproducing naturally, and they were gradually starting to use all that available habitat surrounding where they had been released. It's definitely not an ideal situation. It's kind of making the best of what is essentially a pretty crappy situation. But in some cases, it is the best that we got. And we were at least happy to see that the animals that we moved to Eglin were seeming to do pretty well. Turn it back over to.
Thank you.
There are some other opportunities within our region for Gopher Tortoise sites. There is a difference, and we'll probably get a little bit more into this as we get further into the slides, but there is a difference between a Gopher Tortoise waif site and a Gopher Tortoise recipient site. A Gopher Tortoise recipient site through FWC is a site where Gopher Tortoises can be removed through permitting. So if there is a construction site, if there is a project or development plan going on, then that animal can be removed along with all the other individuals that are on that site. A Gopher Tortoise that is considered a waif is an animal that has no home, that has no direct location. So waifs would be considered an animal that was brought to the FWC office location, an animal that is picked up off the side of the road, where we can't return it to where its natal burrow is, where it should be coming from. We don't know. We don't have that information. So those Gopher Tortoise waifs cannot be put onto a recipient site. They would need to be put onto a waif site. There's currently not a Gopher Tortoise waif site north of Ocala. There's only 2 waif sites currently in the state that are south of Ocala. So that is something that Billy and I are working towards as far as priorities for this region, is providing that priority and meeting those conservation needs for Gopher tortoises. So what can you do to help? Aside from keeping Gopher tortoises away from your domestic dogs, not letting them dig up any of their burrows, but generally just leaving them be. And they know what they're doing. They've been doing it for hundreds of thousands of years. Helping Gopher tortoises across the roadways, if it's safe for you to do so, if you can move them in the same direction that they're already moving, that is ideal. Place it in a safe area off the roadside in the direction it was headed, and never move the tortoise elsewhere. Put it in your car and take it to a different location. They will try to get back to their burrow, even if it is miles and miles away. They have really high sight fidelity. You can also notify FWC. There's a wildlife alert hotline if the tortoise is in a precarious location. They do not go out into the ocean or out into the Gulf for extended periods of time. So sometimes they can be found going out into waterways to rinse off ticks. So they will go out into salt water if they are in a coastal ecosystem to remove themselves of parasites or ticks, but they do not spend exorbitant amounts of time in the water. So that is not their primary location. So letting them go in the water is not helpful to them, and as well as keeping dogs away.
Can they swim at all?
They can't swim.
Actually very buoyant.
Oh.
We have a question online if you want it now.
Of course.
How long will a Gopher tortoise use the same burrow?
It varies a lot.
It does. So it will vary a lot between individual, sometimes between season as well. So sometimes they'll prefer to be in a location that is more sunny if their burrow is facing the rising sun or the setting sun at different seasons. So it really just depends on their mood and their location.
Had transmitters on tortoises where we've tracked them continuously for periods of time, and some have dug in a matter of months multiple burrows, and others just continue to use the same burrow year after year.
Thank you. That was a great question. Thank you. For urban habitat, you can see the Gopher tortoise in a variety of locations. They do like to dig under structures, and they are found sometimes on roadways where it's nice and mowed and nice and open. Since historically development has occurred where it's easiest to build, like high, dry, sandy places, Gopher tortoises continue to coexist with people and use the same habitat. Thank you all so much for joining us and learning more about Gopher tortoises with us. We have some carapaces to share with you that are comparing and contrasting some of the different aspects of each of these species of turtles and tortoises, and we would love to share. Does anyone have any questions for myself or Billy? Yes.
Are there any around here?
Absolutely.
There are.
There are.
Because I had the impression they were like vanishing and you had to go further north or something. I don't know what kind of deal.
That is a correct impression. You might not be seeing as many as you would have in the past. there are a decline in the species population in this area. They were used as a food source and potentially still are used as a food source, which is not legal to do, but that is a correct assumption. So they are primarily further down south. Our populations have changed to live here.
Yeah, one more question online. Will gopher tortoises have multiple clutches of eggs during the nesting season or just one clutch per season?
Generally just one per season.
Generally just one per season.
So you mentioned they have high site fidelity. So do you tend to have issues where you're relocating ones and then they end up back where they're originally from?
Yeah, so we didn't get too much into it, but that is with these translocation animals, generally they're going to have some kind of pen. Usually it's going to be silt fence, and where they're released seems like the longer that you can keep them in a confined area, they eventually start to settle in and settle down. I think it's usually, I can't remember what the minimum is, but generally, yeah, it's 6 months. I think generally over a year or more is ideal before you remove that pen's a soft release situation. And that seems to really get them to kind of reassess, and they tend to stick around a little better. Otherwise, if you just dump them on the landscape, they typically just shoot off in a random direction. You don't have a population, you just have individuals that have gone into wherever they ended up stopping, but couldn't find where they were trying to get back to home.
Another question online. How much does a developer pay to relocate a gopher tortoise?
That's an excellent question. So it really depends. There are private entities that do charge a couple $1,000s to receive gopher tortoises as part of a recipient site program. Some of the requirements of a recipient site program are that they have to have a pretty extensive management plan. So it can't just be someone's yard. It has to have a minimum of 5 acres, and it has to have certain aspects of herbaceous cover and canopy cover to meet those recipient site requirements. So it is not easy for very good reasons to ensure the population persists if there are translocated or there are relocated tortoises into that location. So it really depends. The private consultants set their prices. You know, as a government agency, we don't have a hand in those private industries, but the private consultant will set their price on what it takes to dig burrows, remove animals, or relocate animals, and then the recipient site sets the price to receive the animals.
Is there an application to become a recipient site? How do you go about?
There is. It's a pretty extensive list. There is some more information online, but it does get set by set. And then there is a recipient site Gopher Tortoise biologist that will review the site based on herbaceous material, canopy cover, and you have to have that site plan. So there's an extensive process to get set up to be the recipient site.
Since there's such,
Oh, 1 second.
building had said that they tried to keep them in this one area for 6 months to a
At
year.
least 6 months.
How do you do that?
Usually silt fence is the easiest material
Really,
to.
they don't just
They,
dig under it
it's-
They can't.
go on their way?
Yeah, yeah, I mean, generally, it's a process, I mean, it's expensive, yeah, typically we're coming in with equipment, so root rake would come through and you're putting the fence like pretty deep underground, so hypothetically, they, generally when they go down, they don't come back up like moles. So, I mean, what they do regularly go under the fence and burrow under the fence, but typically they don't get out the other side, unless something tears the fence. So over time, they find their ways out, but it's we try to dig it deep enough that it's not easy for them. Just like
How big an area would you need to go for them to eat?
it depends on how many tortoises you're receiving, how big the site is. For Eglin, they're pretty large. I mean, it's miles and miles of silt fence because we're receiving a lot of animals at the same time. And each site is permitted for a certain amount of animals, based like for a stocking density, essentially. So the bigger the site, the more animals, and the better the habitat. Potentially, the more that you could potentially release.
I guess they don't mind jet noise.
No, we generally try to keep them away from the, the loudest parts of the base.
Well said, thank you.
Have
Good question.
So you mentioned too that there's really high mortality in the nest. So is this part of FWC's management plan cover protecting the nest or relocating eggs at all?
I think the burrow.
The burrow,
Yeah, I
the
don't know,
burrow.
it's not the management plan. I mean, yes, head starting is one perspective method for conservation, just like essentially just raising them to a size where they don't have to worry about predators so much. A concern is kind of like an artificial inflation of certain nest predators like raccoons, possums, especially in urban areas. There's probably more of them than there would be naturally, so that's always a concern. Yeah, those are prospective ways to kind of bolster recruitment, but not something specific that FWC necessarily does.
Another question online, does FWC monitor if a translocation is successful?
Absolutely.
And then
That's
does
really fun.
FWC do pre-application site visits for recipient sites prior to permit submittal or only after documents have been submitted for the site?
Absolutely. There are Gopher Tortoise biologists that are happy to come out and check out the site as long as you're meeting all of the minimum requirements. They're happy to help you out as well as to guide you in the direction to make that habitat suitable for the species. Billy has actually brought some brochures, and there are some available online of what you can do to get your habitat, your acreage set for the species that you're trying to manage for. So if you're trying to manage for Gopher tortoises, there are ways to do that, and we'll help you out with get you connected with different folks that are doing prescribed burns on their properties, as well as more information for you on what we're looking for to make it a recipient site. Fantastic questions, thank you.
Question.
Yeah, of course, of course.
The males and the females, do they just stay apart? Do they avoid each other in any way? I'm just thinking like where the women all kind of hang together, and the lionesses all hang together, and then they've got the teenage males out there around. Are they kind of like that, or are they more integrated?
They have a less complex social structure than elephants, so they're primarily ignoring each other except when it's season. So except when it's breeding season, then the males will start interacting with each other, when they start fighting for space, territory, start kind of interacting with each other in that way, as well as interacting with the females where they're bobbing their heads and they're trying to display that they're the most fit male. So they will start interacting with each other once they hit a certain age class and season.
So the females get to choose.
For the most part, yes. And there are ways for her to escape, just like with the manatees. There are ways for her to escape, so they have a different.
If she's in the burrow, like I mentioned, they're really good at they don't want something to come in, they can. And that includes other tortoises, so.
If you're not the best kiddo in town, you're not coming.
Exactly. There is actually some interesting recent research with into social dynamics where it is maybe a little more complicated than we initially thought. So there's some, the gist of it is they seem to have weird little social cliques where certain individuals seem to interact with each other more than others. Even, the neighbor might be closer and those two never come near each other, but yeah, somebody half a mile away routinely shows up at the doorsteps. It's not interesting. More so than we thought for a turtle that lives on the ground.
Yeah, excellent question. Social structure of tortoises. Do we have any more questions online?
I have one more. With a minimum of 5 acres, what density can be supported?
Trying to get the exact number. I don't know off the top of my head for stocking density. I want to say it's 5 an acre, but that's just off the top of my head. So I do apologize. I don't remember that one off the top of my head, but it is available on the FWC website.
Is there a minimum acreage
For,
For a recipient site.
yes, for recipient site, it's a minimum of 5 acres.
Okay, so 5 acres is the.
Great questions.
Is there a certain area that you're looking to have recipient sites?
Yes.
It's well, I mean, like
Absolutely.
part of the panhandle, I guess, because my parents live out in Shipley on 22 acres and they have gopher tortoises there now, but they would probably be interested in becoming a recipient site.
That is definitely a consideration. If they currently have a healthy population, that's part of something they take into consideration. So it would not necessarily be ideal to have a population, let's say from Volusia County, to move up here with a current population. So we're primarily looking for spots that don't have tortoises, that are perfect habitat, but that don't currently have a healthy population. So we're looking to relocate tortoises to a non-populated area.
If you had like 1 or 2 in your front yard or something, that's probably different than if you had 50 that were already there.
Well, they've seen one burrow, but it was clearly unused at the time. So they're like, obviously they're here, but we don't know in what capacity or how
And that might-
frequently.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
I think there are questions online are winding down. Any other questions before we wrap up?
And we have our contact information here on the slide. And you're always more than welcome to give us a call or shoot us an email, and we're happy to interact and answer any questions you might have in the future.
Cool. Well, thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. All right, so just one more announcement before we wrap up. Got one more slide here. So we are wrapping up the end of our spring series for Tides and Talks. We have one more speaker coming in May this year, and that is the Northwest Florida Water Management District coming to speak on Econfina Creek and Springs. So please join us May 14th for our last one of the spring season. All righty. All right, now you're free. Thank you. If you wanted to get a closer look at some of the items that we brought here today, we have brought everything from carapaces for a variety of turtle species, as well as skulls. It's actually a Gopher Tortoise skull.
How old would it be? That tweet that small.
This one, it would be tough to tell just based on skull. It's an adult, but a fairly young individual. Definitely. Maybe the size, maybe closer to the size, definitely not the same class.
It says 4 tortoises online, in the management for per acre.
This one is a soft shell turtle. And this individual was. Oh, this was a big animal that and you can see the difference between the two skulls. This one's got significantly longer sagittal crest, where all of the musculature coming from the back of the skull is connected on the back here. So it gives this animal an incredible bite force. So this goes.
Box turtle?
This one is a soft shell.
Soft
Soft shell turtle.
And probably love sugar cane fields if they got light force like that.
Second people. Yeah, that stuff is tough.
It's a big difference. It is, yeah. It's very unique. And the eye sockets are also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They just don't have the beaks like a lot of